Hello, I'm Nini. I'm a Year 12 student from the British International School in Ho Chi Minh City.
I'm David Puttnam. I'm a former filmmaker. I was also president of UNICEF UK for 7 years. I've been involved all of my life in environmental issues and concerns of the developing world. I've traveled very widely, and I'm very happy to be talking to Nini today.
I'd like to start a little bit with your youth and how you were brought up. I feel like that would be really interesting. So my first question is, what was life like when you were in your youth, and what were some key events that were happening locally or globally at that time?
Well, I'm fairly rare in being what's called a Blitz baby. That's to say, I was born in the London Blitz, literally. So my mother was expecting me right the way through. The split started in September 1940 and extended through to May 1941. I was born in February 41. So I was literally what's termed a Blitz baby. My father was away in the war. I didn't meet him until I was nearly 5. So I had a rather unusual childhood. Literally living in a shelter. My clearest memories as a 2-3-year-old were living behind wire. So we used to sleep in a bed that was set up underneath a steel table, which was in case the house was bombed, and surrounded by these these wire mesh. So I looked at the world for several years through wire mesh every night. And my sister was 2 years younger than me. And those are all my earliest memories. Plus my dad coming home, which was the most kind of exciting day of my life. I even put it into a scene in a movie I produced years later. And my dad then became my hero because he'd been a sort of legendary figure. I only knew him through photographs, and I knew him through what my mother told me. So this big guy suddenly enters the house. And I was in a house entirely of women. I was the only male in the household. My grandmother lived with us and everything else. So that was a very powerful thing. And he came back and he was wonderful. I just thought he was wonderful. And he proved to be. My dad has been my hero my whole life. And I think, in a sense, pretty well everything I've done in my life has been looking for his approval. And when I got my final fellowship, as you can see this on YouTube, from BAFTA, the British Academy, I talked about my father. It was the first time I'd ever talked publicly about my relationship with him. So he was a huge figure in my life.
Was he one of the reasons why you got into filmmaking? Did you want to share some experiences that were similar to that when you were young?
I think the answer to that is yes and no. My dad was a photographer. He worked for Associated Press. So the world of images was a world I was brought up with, and photographs I was brought up with. And he would critique each day's newspaper in terms of whether it was a good edition or not a good edition. I expected to go into Fleet Street, which is where all the newspapers were. And for one reason or another, he didn't want me to. So by the time I left school quite young. I left school when I was 16. He pointed me into advertising. And I went and became a messenger in an advertising agency. And that actually proved to be fantastic. I discovered that I loved work. At school, I wasn't sure I loved work. But once I went into the world of work, I discovered I loved work. And I used to have a long train journey to work. So I started reading a lot. And that was a very interesting period. Then I went to night school. So I realized that I'd really missed out on an education, formal education. So I went to night school for 4 years. During that time, I got married. Our daughter was born. Our first child was born. And that was a tough time in a way, but it was a period of growing for me. I was forced, because I got married young, I was forced to become very responsible very quickly. And that combination of that and the influence of my father, I think, in a sense, set the bedrock of my life. And we've been married now 60 years. So I obviously married the right person.
So I have a follow-up question. Considering your childhood, did you have any optimism for the future, or were you very focused on what was going on with your life at that moment?
It's a great question, because post-war Britain, whilst on the one hand was very subdued, it was kind of grey, very black and white. On the other hand, there was this surge of hope. We developed the national health system. All of a sudden, they spent money on schools. And I remember as a child being ill once or twice, and the quality of hospitals was great. So there was a sense that the new world, the world of the 1950s and beyond, was going to be a lot more interesting and something to be part of that was quite exciting. So despite the fact that we still had rationing, for example. So I couldn't go into a shop and buy sweets until I was 14. People forget that. So whilst in one hand it was quite a grim era in some respects, but it was a very, very, very hopeful era. And I was lucky enough to be brought up in that sense that the world we were moving into was going to be the better than the world we moved away from.
Did you anticipate any change that you would see today?
No, I don't think I did. I've look back on my life. I've been remarkably lucky. I was 20 in 1961. London particularly, but the UK changed dramatically between 1961 and 1964. It literally became a different country, largely interesting enough, driven by music and cultural change. And I was so very, very fortunate to be part of that change. I was living in central London, married, had a good job, and so I was able to be part of a cultural shift, which was very optimistic. Now, bear in mind, this was happening at the same time that the United States, which I was beginning to visit, part of my job, President Kennedy was killed. Later on, Bobby Kennedy was killed. Martin Luther King was killed. So the world was in a strange place. On the one hand, it seemed to be a very exciting place, and things were changing very rapidly. On the other hand, some terrible things were happening. So it was a fascinating period to grow up in. What was most important is, for a young person then, everything seemed possible. The world was opening up for you. The world of my parents seemed to have been left behind, and the world was mine. It was mine and my generations to either make a mess of, which I think we successfully did, or take advantage of.
That's really interesting. Do you think there's some kind of similar cultural change now? I know that we don't have many very iconic emerging figures, but I think like globally there is a cultural change. I think more towards the environment and more towards equality. Do you think that's happening right now in the world?
I think it's changing in one important sense. I think there's an awareness amongst your generation that you can't allow things to go on as they are. And I think that's very, very important. And to an extent, that was true of my generation when I was a little older than you are now. So I think that's happening. On the other hand, I think the world is an infinitely more dangerous place than it was. When I was growing up, the only real danger was was the possibility of a nuclear war. And that kind of hovered over us. You've now got the whole issue of climate, which is infinitely more difficult because it's a creeping danger. It's not an imminent danger. And getting people's attention, getting people to understand the ramifications, the implications of climate change are really quite difficult. I mean, I spent, as you know, quite a bit of time in Vietnam, and I'm very conscious that the east coast of Vietnam is very vulnerable. I'm very conscious of the vulnerability of the Mekong River and the Delta. So I think there's a sense in Southeast Asia generally of the fragility of the planet, but I'm not sure that sense is shared generally around the world. So in a sense, you're in a better position to look at what is and may be happening than probably people in Western Europe. In fact, definitely people in Western Europe.
I think there has been a shift in awareness towards the environment because when I was a child, we didn't really have any conversations about pollution or the environment. But now I see there are like posters around and there are notices from the government. So I think we are shifting towards it. But because we're a developing country, it's a little bit more difficult than European nations, as you say, because we still need to focus on economic development, but at the same time, we are trying to become more green. So I think that's a problem that many Southeast Asian countries might have.
I'm not just saying this because you and I have been chatting. I'm a huge fan of Vietnam. I think you're an extraordinarily resourceful people and resilient people, much, much more resourceful and resilient than my own people in Western Europe, who are pretty complacent, had it very easy for quite a long time. So I think there's an energy and a resourcefulness within Southeast Asia generally, but Vietnam in particular, that will allow you to make changes or to accept changes and deal with changes in a much more sensible way than is likely to be accomplished and I'm using Western Europe or certainly the United States. So I think that the character of the Vietnamese people is more adjusted to the kind of changes and kind of challenges we're going to be facing than for example, my own family.
So do you have any aspirations for the youth, or how do you feel about what the youth are doing right now about world issues?
I think the most important aspiration is you get told the truth, and you don't stop until you're told the truth. I think there's an enormous pressure on politicians, indeed, and the media generally, to try to give you the sense that things are going to be okay. On the other hand, there's a very important balance here. There's no point in becoming alarmist, because if people become alarmist, people give up. So your job is to really, really get people to focus on what can be done, what should be done, and demand that you're given the facts with which to work. Because if you're not told the truth, if you're not given the facts, you're not going to make the right decisions. And you're going to have to make some very powerful decisions. By the time you're, frankly, Nini, by the time you're 22, 23, you're going to be required to be making huge decisions. The kind of decision that basically are almost unfair to place on 23-year-old shoulders, but you're going to have to. And you can only make the right decisions if you're given the right facts and told the truth. So the big demand for you is, what's the truth of our situation? Where is this going? What can we do? And indeed, what can't we do?
Do you feel that we as a generation have more of a responsibility to educate ourselves and push back on what we feel is right?
I think you've unfairly, I think very unfairly, you had a responsibility placed on your shoulders by my generation, and indeed my children's generation, that you're going to have a tough time dealing with. But you're going to have to, you as a generation, are going to have to grow up very, very, very fast. Because I think that 2030, people talk about 2030, I think by 2028, 2027, you're going to begin to see some really quite serious implications of climate change. So you think about that. If this is happening in 2028, let's say, that's the moment where you as a generation are going to have to step up. Well, most generations don't have to do that until they're in their 40s. So I think that, the growing up process, the taking responsibility process is going to come very quickly to you. On the other hand, because of what I'm listening to and people like yourselves, I think you can do it.
I think I agree that there is pressure on us, but it does push and drive us forward so that we can achieve more. I understand that you worked with UNICEF. You were president of UNICEF in the UK. Did you work on any climate-related advocacy with them?
The only area during the 7 years I was president, the area was water. We worked in places like Mozambique, trying to ensure that water reached people who had periods of drought during the year. So yes, we had quite a lot of water projects. I did one in Laos. I did one in Mozambique. I think there was one in Nigeria as well. But a lot of it was actually also conflict resolution. So I spent a fair amount of time in the Balkans, dealing with both refugees, and that was a real issue, but also some terrible issues we had with very young children, and basically the raiding of orphanages and finding children that have been lost, and this indeed even the sale of children. I did some of that work in Thailand as well, dealing with exploitation of children. So yeah, it was a sort of fairly mixed bag, not directly environmental other than the water projects.
So over the years, have you seen the impact of your projects, or has it still stayed the same? Do you feel like there's a lack of accountability because there's still a lot of conflict on, as well as, yes?
I think a lot of attention was paid to the Balkans because in a sense they were within Europe, and I think some serious progress was made there. The most demoralizing place I worked for me was Nigeria, because there was no sense of nationhood there. You couldn't appeal to nationhood. Whereas when I had two periods actually in Southeast Asia. One was with UNICEF, and later I became the trade and cultural envoy for the UK in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So I was able to see change taking place, and for the most part, a very positive change. But there I was working on democracy, on the rule of law, on particularly on making sure that courts around the world were not corrupt, and that lawyers, there was a freedom of expression. Those were the areas in which I was working on in the second part of my relationship with Southeast Asia. But go back to Nigeria for a second. Nation building is very hard, and nations need to see themselves as entities. There has to be a pride in what a country is and what way it sees itself. And that I found, particularly in Nigeria, almost entirely missing. Nigeria was a country of well over 100 million people as individuals. and you get the sense that it's only about them as individuals. There isn't a sense of cohesion. There isn't a sense of unity. Whereas I think, again, in Southeast Asia, that does exist. There is a sense of nationhood and of shared purpose.
So you did have roles in policymaking and the implementation of the rule of law?
Yes, very much the latter. The implementation of the rule of law became a big issue in the latter part of my period. This was around 2016, 17, 18. I did a lot of work on the rule of law.
What do you think is important for, like you said, unity in a country and the sense of unity that citizens may have with their government?
And so, because I've got a very simple one line answer: trust. I did a report for the government here in the UK, in Britain, on trust, and I actually called it digital democracy and the resurrection of trust. That the evidence we took over a period of a year gave the impression that the absence of trust in politicians, absence of trust in civil society was really serious. And just as you'll find, you have to create trust within a family. You have to create trust in whoever your partner is. You can't build societies in a vacuum of trust. So trust for me is vital. And trust, and there's a direct relationship between the rule of law and trust. If you can't trust the law, you can't trust anything. And so the creation of trust, the creation of an honest generation of politicians, an honest generation of policymakers is absolutely vital to nation building.
Do you think the implementation of the digital world had an effect on the trust that people may have?
Yes, I think the digital world, rather casual relationship with truth and trust has seriously undermined the confidence of people. Basically, a lot of the social media companies are outrage factories, where basically, because they are able to make more money as a result of the stimulation of outrage and the amount of engagement outrage produces, they have no real problem. I would argue they haven't taken enough moral responsibility for the messaging and the way in which their messages are delivered. So I've been seeking, and I'm not the only one, believe me, a lot of people are seeking far more accountability and far more responsibility from the social media companies, because the power of social media could be, if it were turned correctly, could be enormously important. It really could be. But at the moment, the absence of accountability by the people who run those companies is creating more problems than it's creating advantages.
So do you think social media has had an impact on division or more towards unity?
Yes, there's no question. The impact of social media at present doesn't have to remain this way. Impact of social media at present is divisive, and that hurts all of us as citizens. And just for example, climate change, the amount of damage that climate denialism did, the amount of damage that inoculation denialism relating to COVID has done is enormous. And it constantly gets banned and then justified as being freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, I absolutely believe in freedom of speech, but it has to carry with it responsibility for the accuracy or at least the integrity of what you're saying. You can't always rely on being accurate, but what is important is that there is an integrity in what you're saying, and that you've done your best to find out the truth of what you're saying. Unfortunately, none of those measures are really used in the world of social media.
Yeah, I do think app developers have a responsibility to inform the public of what is actual fact and what is fiction, but I feel that there's a lack of accountability because they might face a lot of backlash, especially since like climate deniers or vaccine hesitants. It's quite a large movement, so I think if they did try to debunk it, they would face a lot of backlash from those people. So I think that may be a reason why.
Well, of course, the problem in particular with climate denial is it's very convenient to be told that actually it's not as big a problem as we think it is. People, that's a comfort zone. When you say that to someone, you're actually hitting into their comfort zone. So that means they actually don't have to take the actions that they need to take, that they don't have to take this thing as seriously. They don't have to start rethinking the way the economy works. So it's a very comfortable area in which to plant people. So that's what makes it so dangerous. Oh, I see. So you can say, look, for many, many years, 98% of the world's scientists were saying we were heading into a dangerous place. 2% suggested we weren't. And yet the amount of attention paid to those 2% was totally disproportionate because they were offering a much more comforting message.
I think because climate change is quite slow and you can't physically see it or see it happening in front of you, and it's easier to blame like large corporations, and it's not very easy for you to take action yourself. I feel that's a large reason why there hasn't been any action or little action towards climate change.
I think that's half the reason. I think the other reason is that the very nature of us as human beings, we are extremely well conditioned to deal with emergencies. We're remarkable, actually, at dealing with emergencies when we see them. I always think we're a little bit like gerbils. You know, gerbils are always looking for what's happening. We're good like that. What we're very bad at is looking at long-term issues and taking actions ahead of time to ensure that we minimize the damage that those long-term issues are. So it is a flaw in our DNA almost, but we're better attuned to dealing with crises than we are to planning and accommodating to long-term potential crises.
What do you think can be done now?
One of the problems is, certainly in terms of democracy is very short-term by its very nature. People in democracies are already looking at the next election, and they're looking for what messages will go down well with the majority of the population at the next election. Well, a lot of the messages that you and I are very familiar with are pretty uncomfortable. So for a good, even the very best democratic politician to be advancing messages and policies which are discomforting is very hard, because their principal objective is to try and get elected. So there's an issue as to whether Western-style democracy is going to be able to accommodate itself to the nature of the crisis that climate change presents. Doesn't mean I don't believe in democracy, believe me, but it does mean that we may have to rethink the way we do it.
Do you feel that many politicians will just say what's convenient to the public and then make promises, then move on?
Yeah. I think, in fact, I think what they try to do is tailor their policies to be the least difficult, which will to allow themselves to be re-elected. So, in fact, what you've got is a constant trimming towards the middle. I mean, one of the early questions was what my childhood was like, and what Britain was like immediately after the war. One of the reasons so many changes occurred, and one of the reasons why there was so much hope, is because we had a stark reminder of where we didn't want to be. We did not want to be back in a world war. We had 2 world wars. Those world wars probably were avoidable if we'd been smarter about the conditions that were being created that made them somewhat inevitable. So I think that what we're missing at the moment, actually, Nini, this is quite important. We're missing that wall. We're missing that sense that we got to do this. We're sort of thinking at the moment that we have too many options. That yeah, we could do that. We could do a bit of that, and maybe we could do that. But it's not quite like that. So we're missing that stark reality that as a child I was brought up with.
So you think there's a lack of a sense of urgency?
Yes.
With the climate.
Much better way of putting it. There is absolutely a lack of urgency, and there's also a lack of understanding of what the ramifications will be if we don't develop a sense of urgency.
How do you think this could be improved, or this complacency could be mitigated?
Getting, for example, your parents, your grandparents, to understand what your lives are likely to be like if we don't correct this. So it's very important for you to be able to get across to them, this is how I don't want my life to be. So just using the analogy I just used, coming out of World War II, we knew we didn't want to go back there. You need to have the imagination, and this is a cultural issue really, have sufficient imagination to be able to say to your parents and your grandparents, look, this is what it could be like for me. I don't want that. You don't want that for me. You absolutely don't want that for me. But this is what we have to do in order to prevent life as I suspect is going to pan out. Does that make sense?
Yes,
so that's a cultural issue. It's a question of you conjuring up the imagination to persuade them of what the impact of inaction will be on your lives. It's quite a task.
Do you think the media or the arts also have a role?
Yeah, I think the arts have a huge role. Basically, the arts, certainly the area of the arts I work in, we're storytellers. So our job is to remind people of the past, the stories from the past, and then, in a sense, to blow a horn as to what could be happening in the future. We're pretty good at doing the former, that's to say, talking about the past. We haven't been very good at telling those stories that will alert people to the nature of the future. And when we do, it looks like science fiction. And that's a problem. We're not talking about a science fiction world. We're talking about a science fact world, quite predictable. You know, what heat does to people, what heat does to agriculture, what heat does to water shortages, what heat does to the Antarctic. These are all Antarctic. These are all absolutely predictable. But what we need to do is conjure those up in the form of stories so that people understand them better.
So how do you think these social attitudes could be reflected through the arts?
I'd love to see a few more movies made about the way in which life might be for you 10, 15 years from now. But I'd like to see them done not as apocalyptic, but as what life on a daily, what would be like for you to go to the market in 2035? What products will be available to you? What will the nature of your relationship with your, let's say by then you have a husband and children. What's the nature of your relationship with them? What will be the additional difficulties for you bringing up your children because of that 2035, 2040 world? Because that's the world you're going to live in.
I also agree. I think filmmakers, artists, musicians should have some kind of responsibility to reflect the current world, as well as using it as an outlet for self-expression. I feel like they could also integrate some of what's going on in real life into their work.
Bob Dylan, the singer, is 3 months younger than me, so we're almost contemporaries. And he said something quite early in his career. He said, look, if you have the power to change the way in which people live their lives or see themselves, why on earth wouldn't you use it? And he was referring to musicians, absolutely. And I would say the same thing about filmmakers. If you have the ability to get people to reflect on their lives and make judgments about their lives, why on earth wouldn't you want to use it?
How do you feel that the film industry could change? Or do you think that it's fine as it is?
The key challenge for you and your generation is to deal with complexity. And the problem with the film industry, up to certainly recently, is it tries to deal in simplicity. It tries to say to you that some superhero, man or woman, is going to come down and solve your problems for you. That's not going to happen. So in fact, it's selling you a false promise. So I think the film industry would do all of us a favor by beginning to deal with complexity, by beginning to deal with grapple with the problems that really are there, and at the same time, and I use the word advisedly, really entertain. A film that really knocked my socks off a couple of years ago was Joker. I thought Joker was brilliant. It was brilliant because it took what was a Marvel comic character, but it developed a film of such complexity in terms of mental illness, the media, manipulation of the media. It was actually a film about revolution in its own way. And yet it went out and it earned over $1 billion. So it's not that the audience isn't there for complex stories or fascinating stories. It's just that the filmmakers aren't necessarily at the moment being permitted to deal in complexity. The world is complex. The issues are complex. The future is complex. Why on earth wouldn't we be making movies that illustrated that complexity and offered us some routes through it?
So do you think good art, good film, music could still be made by straying away from cliches and kind of delving into more complex themes?
Yes, I do. And I think it'll happen. I think these things happen in waves. Something will happen. It'll be a movie. It'll be some music. It'll be something. Something will happen in the next 2-3 years. There'll be an emergence of a generation of artists who will understand the responsibility that comes with the enormous sums of money which are currently available. Enormous sums of money are available to artists all around the world at the moment. And I think a realization that business as usual is not actually going to be very productive will occur. When? I'm not sure. Will it be music? Will it be art? Will it be movies? I'm not sure of that either. But they tend to have an ability to work together. And so when a movement starts in music, it gets picked up in movies. When a movie starts in art, it can be picked up in movies and in music. So keep your eyes peeled. You know, what's really interesting about Vietnam, I never cease to be amazed, both in Ho Chi Minh City and in Hanoi, how many artists there are. It's quite staggering. And how inventive a lot of that art is, which is also quite staggering. All that needs to happen is that imagination, that invention needs to be applied to human beings and not just sold to tourists. So, I mean, in a funny way, the art scene in Vietnam is a little bit like the movie scene in that it deals in simplicity. Oh, I see. I sold one of those last year. I'll paint another one of them. Or I sold 10 of those last year. I'll now paint another 10 of them. Well, that isn't really being an artist. That's being a copyist. And I'd suggest the same is true of filmmakers.
I agree, and I'm so happy that you've observed this about Ho Chi Minh as well as Hanoi, coming from a Vietnamese person.
Yeah. And I genuinely, I really love, interestingly, I love both cities. People are always saying to me, do you prefer Ho Chi Minh City or Hanoi? I think they're very different, and I think they both have absolute extraordinary charm.
From my observations, because I'm Saigonese, I was born here and I've lived here all my life. I feel like Ho Chi Minh deals with art and development in a much more modern way than Hanoi does. I think Hanoi has more of an appreciation for traditional culture, that they use that to advance their development in art. But here we take a lot of outside influence, and I feel there's a lot more freedom here. But I feel like these two cities do both have their own benefits and do advance Vietnam culturally in many ways.
Well, I shouldn't think what I tried to do, and I'm not sure I entirely succeeded, because I had very good relationships with the political group that I've worked with, is to get them to look at Korea, look at the way that Korea has successfully invested in the arts, right, all the arts, right across from gaming through to music, through to movies, through to the lot, and to try to see how the arts can be used as an economic driver and a cultural driver and a reputational driver for an entire country. And if there's any one thing I think's been missing in Vietnam, not so much in the last 10 years, but earlier, is that sense of turning Vietnam into a whole country. Because of the shape of Vietnam, it's very, very easy to see it as somewhat divided culturally and geographically. So that sense of what it is to be, I used to say to politicians in Vietnam, what is it to be? What's the essential ingredient of being Vietnamese? What's the core of it? And then quite with some difficulty, they explain history and everything else. But culture can do that job for you. Culture can define, we are a people. We've been challenged historically for 300-400 years. We've hung together. We're resilient. We are who we are. We have a language that works, or they've got all the minority tribes. And I think there's been a lack of belief at the center, maybe from Hanoi, in the power of art to homogenize and to harmonize the different aspects of Vietnam. And I think I failed there. I tried very, very hard to push that message, but I don't think I succeeded.
I'm glad that you like Vietnam so much, and I will take into the observations that you've made. It was very nice having you here and talking to you, and I hope that we could stay in touch. And thank you so much for coming. Do you have any last words that you want to say, Lord Puttnam?
No, I wanted to say was that among the happiest periods of my life was being president of the UNICEF UK. I learned more during those 7 years than probably anything I ever did at any other point in my life. And I think it changed me. My wife and my daughter used to come with me on some trips. It changed them, changed our perspective on the world. And I think it made us better people. In fact, I know it did.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and I hope you visit Vietnam again soon.
Thank you very much indeed. So do I. Bye, Nini.